And we have Mr. Kenneth Hafeli speaking to us tonight. He's presenting the Ford Waco Glider. Mr. Hafeli worked for almost 40 years as a senior audiovisual archivist at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum in Ann Arbor, and has spent over 40 years researching Ford Motor Company in the Upper Peninsula and has written several papers on the topic. Tonight we will hear about the Ford Kingsford plant and the CG-4A glider. Please help me welcome Kenneth Hafeli.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say that Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor. The museum is in Grand Rapids. So that's a whole nother story for another night. Okay, in June 1941, the Ford Motor Company's plant in Iron Mountain, Michigan, faced a bright future. Now it says Kingsford because it actually was in Kingsford, but Ford considered it to be in Iron Mountain because that's where the headquarters were located. So we've always referred to it as the Iron Mountain plant, but it was actually in Kingsford. And I put this way as a deference to the residents of Kingsford who would complain to me afterwards. With Ford recently recognizing the United Auto Workers as the sole bargaining representative, the 5,500 workers at Iron Mountain had job security and manufactured a popular product, the Ford station wagon, as well as numerous chemicals and charcoal briquettes. But 6 months later, Pearl Harbor destroyed those prospects and threatened the livelihood of the entire area. Only the efforts of plant manager Walter G. Nelson and his superiors in Dearborn prevented the plant from shutting down. Founded in 1879, when iron mining was the key industry in the Upper Peninsula, Iron Mountain soon became the area's largest city after Marquette. Located in the southwest corner of the Upper Peninsula, the region is more closely related to Wisconsin than Michigan. See, Iron Mountain is right where the rabbit's foot comes down on the Upper Peninsula there. Henry Ford's association with the area began in 1920. In constant fear of his company going into debt, Ford wanted to make his company self-sufficient. He began this by purchasing rubber plantations in South America, partnering with tire magnate Harvey Firestone. He also bought coal mines in West Virginia and Kentucky, but he also wanted to add iron and timber to his inventory. During the course of one of his celebrated camping trips with Firestone and Thomas Edison and John Burroughs, Ford became enamored with the thought of purchasing property in the UP. With the assistance of Iron Mountain resident E.G. Kingsford, a cousin by marriage and a local land agent, Ford purchased over 313,000 acres of UP timberland. He later added 2 iron mines, and at Kingsford's insistence, Ford chose Iron Mountain, over 500 miles from his Dearborn headquarters, to be the cornerstone for his northern Michigan empire. Almost immediately, Henry Ford set about developing the site to suit his needs. Within months, the company opened a sawmill. Shortly after the completion of the mill, Ford built a dam and hydroelectric plant, and later added drying kilns, making the Iron Mountain facility one of the largest sawmill complex in the entire world. Between 1920 and 1923, the population of Iron Mountain and the newly created village of Kingsford increased from 5,000 to 15,000, a figure that remained constant during the 3 decades Ford operated in the Upper Peninsula. The company proved a boon for the entire area, pumping nearly $24,000 per day into the local economy. The Iron Mountain plant manufactured wood body parts for the iconic Model T. These were sent downstate to downstate body plants, particularly the Briggs Manufacturing Company of Detroit, which completed the bodies, and then they were added to the assembly line to be put onto Ford-built chassis. Besides auto body parts, the sawmill complex also provided wood patterns needed for aircraft, naval, and commercial ships, and railroad car and mining tram production. A chemical distillery turned scrap wood into chemicals used for tanning of leather and producing paint, as well as a multitude of other chemicals. Other scrap wood helped make the plant the largest manufacturer of charcoal briquettes in the country. A Ford-built airfield provided freight and passenger service. Some of these I took off the internet, so they're a little pixelated. The plant almost shut down in the late 1930s due to labor unrest at a number of Detroit body plants. Henry Ford, a well-known opponent of organized labor, canceled his contracts with Briggs and Murray Body. Walter Nelson, the plant manager at Iron Mountain, convinced Charles Sorensen, the Ford production manager, that his plant could produce a complete station wagon body. Despite the apprehension of the engineering department in Dearborn, Sorensen backed Nelson, and shortly afterward, the company added more buildings to the auto assembly portion of the facility. And by 1939, it was one of the largest auto body plants in the world. Iron Mountain is full of superlatives this way. It's the largest this, it's the largest them. Over the next 3 model years, over 35,000 Ford and Mercury station wagons came off the Iron Mountain assembly line, complete with leather seats, radios, and a host of other optional accessories. Once completed, the bodies were sent to River Rouge for assembly onto the undercarriage. Yes. The Ford Motor Company was finally forced to recognize the UAW in June 1941. While Henry Ford still opposed the union, his wife Clara and son Edsel threatened to sell their stock if he didn't sign the UAW contract. With that, Iron Mountain Local 952 came into existence, and the plant was experiencing great prosperity. This all ended, however, with Pearl Harbor. The membership of Local 952 immediately came out in support of the war, voting to stand 100% behind the United States government against the Axis powers. Despite their pledge of support, the Iron Mountain workers faced an uncertain future. Almost immediately, auto manufacturers suspended all domestic automobile production and began to convert to defense production. In January 1942, the Ford Motor Company, seeing very little use for wood products by a modern army, decided to close down the Upper Peninsula operations. For both Iron Mountain and Kingsford, the plant's closing had an immediate effect. 80% of the area's income came from Ford employment, and unemployment soared. The area's military reserve units left for active service, and other young men lined up to enlist. Many Ford employees left to find work elsewhere, often downstate or in defense plants in Chicago, Kansas City, or other Midwestern cities. Only those too old for military duty or unable to find new jobs remained. A concerned Walter Nelson went to Dearborn to make sure his plant would get work. Ford came up short on its earliest efforts to find work for Iron Mountain. It failed on a contract bid for the Higgins amphibious landing craft, with Andrew Higgins leading the opposition. It also lost an attempt to manufacture amphibious jeeps. But after several months of inactivity, circumstances created by the Army gave Ford the opportunity to reopen the plant. In March 1942, the Army Air Corps asked Ford if they were interested in accepting a contract to construct troop-carrying gliders. Prior to the war, the practice of glider warfare was totally foreign to the U.S. Army. However, following Germany's use of gliders during their invasions of Belgium in 1940, and again in Crete in 1941, the British and the United States Army Air Corps both began to seek designs for their own gliders. In early 1942, the Army, after testing several design concepts, chose a model designed by the Waco Aircraft Company of Troy, Ohio. The aircraft, designated the CG-4A, had the capability to carry, among other things, 15 fully equipped men, a 5,000-pound Clark CA-1 bulldozer, which was actually built in Battle Creek, a quarter-ton Jeep, or a 75-ton howitzer, plus their attending crews. Now this is a chart that shows the different things that a single glider could carry. The Army offered the Waco contract to more than a dozen different companies, mostly aircraft manufacturers. Among the contractors were Cessna, General, and Robertson Aircraft, a furniture manufacturer, I love this one, a coffin maker, and the Gibson Refrigerator Company of Greenville, Michigan. Before accepting the Army's contract, Ford sent Nelson and several engineers to Wright Field near Dayton to study the Waco blueprints. Nelson thought his plant could turn out 4 per day and suggested a contract for 1,000 of them. Ford was among the last of the companies to get involved in the glider project. Other manufacturers, especially Waco, were incensed that because of Henry Ford's earlier boast that he could build 1,000 planes per day, so they did not want Ford at all. The head of Waco, Francis RCA, was extremely antagonistic. At a luncheon with aircraft contractors and subcontractors, RCA said to Walter Nelson, loud enough for everyone else in the crowd to hear, "So, the Ford Motor Company is going to build the gliders now, is it? I suppose the next thing Mr. Ford will do will be to make a man out of soybean meal." Now, I'm sure you've all heard the stories about Ford experimenting with soybeans, including making a car body out of them. So, but anyway, at the insistence of the Army, RCA finally conceded, and Ford received a set of blueprints. According to Nelson's reminiscences, Ford engineers made life-size blueprints and found and corrected so many design errors that saved Waco considerable embarrassment. As time went on, Nelson and RCA became good friends. Having examined the blueprints, Ford engineers designed new fixtures and jigs to improve the Waco design. In all, over 70,000 parts went into the construction of the glider. Here are just a few that are on display at the World War II Glider and Military Museum in Ann Arbor, or in Iron Mountain, excuse me. You didn't know that, did you? But there's a lot of tiny pieces that went into building a glider. Meanwhile, while this was all going on, the Iron Mountain plant remained idle, and only those employees planning the glider job even knew that this project was in the works. By mid-April 1942, Ford was satisfied that it could produce the aircraft in Iron Mountain and accepted a contract from the Army to produce 1,000 gliders at a cost of $15,000 each. I remember that figure. Ford's engineers completed their design modifications by June, and in Iron Mountain, workers began to retool the plant for the production of the aircraft. Workmen stripped out 2 of the 3 body plants of their equipment and used the 3rd for storage. When Nelson finally returned to stay in September 1942, nearly all of the buildings on the property, including the dry kilns, the distillery, and the carbonization plant, played a part in the glider project. To convert a plant that produced station wagons to one that made gliders was not very easy. Unlike the Willow Run plant, which Ford designed specifically for the production of B-24 bombers, the Iron Mountain plant suffered from severe design problems. While the Liberators traveled along a moving assembly line, the gliders had to be built on the spot due to the many pillars throughout the plant. Plant doors had to be enlarged to accommodate the plane's 83-foot wingspan. Conversion wasn't limited to the plant either. The project called for less workers than had been laid off in 1942 in January, so only a small number received immediate callbacks. Those employees whose peacetime assignments were useless in glider production learned to perform new tasks. Men who were trimmers and woodcutters for nearly 20 years found themselves learning to operate large sewing machines sent from downstate. Others had to cut and tailor the strong cotton fabric used to cover the glider's wings, tail, and fuselage. Despite the activity, fewer than 2,000 workers were back on the job by January 1943, and it should be noted that there were very few women involved in the glider's production, and it was not on the assembly line, it was in the office. Employment peaked at 3,400 in July of 1945. While Iron Mountain was in the conversion process, Ford built its first glider in Dearborn. The completed ship rolled out to the tarmac of Ford Field in September 1942. The crew of the maiden flight include the pilot and co-pilot, Nelson, and G.F. Kramer of the Ford Engineering Department. Henry Ford, who wanted to be aboard, disappointedly watched the test from the ground with company president Edsel Ford and executive vice president Charles E. Sorensen. According to Nelson, parachutes were worn in case the test was unsuccessful. With the conclusion of the test, Iron Mountain received the go-ahead to begin production, but shortages of essential parts kept the plant from turning out a single glider until December, when only 5 came off the line. In January 1943, the Iron Mountain plant, having solved its supply problems, went into full production of the CG-4A glider. Production in the first 4 months of the year reflected the workers' unfamiliarity with aircraft production. By May, however, the plant began to operate with 3 shifts, 6 days a week, and started to turn out at least 130 gliders per month. Despite the abundance of wood in the Upper Peninsula, the Army Air Corps specified that lightweight Sitka spruce found in the Pacific Northwest be utilized for the glider's plywood components. While their co-workers learned to cut and sew, Ford timber cruisers and sawmill men traveled throughout Washington and Oregon, making arrangements to have the spruce lumber sent east. Recognizing this logistics problem, the Army rewrote the specifications to allow the use of poplar, maple, and birch, all abundant in Michigan. But Ford turned down the Army's offer after testing the 4 wood types and determining spruce to be the strongest. Preparing the wood for production was another problem. The Army did not authorize Iron Mountain's kilns for drying glider wood. This forced Ford to buy their kiln-dried lumber at the point of shipment, but 80% of it had to be re-dried due to non-uniformity and excess moisture. Ford appealed to the Army, and the Army contracted with the Forest Products Laboratory of Madison, Wisconsin to test the kilns for 3 months and before they finally gave their approval. The assembly process consisted of several stages. While the tail and wing assemblies were made of plywood, the actual fuselage consisted of aluminum. For this, Ford subcontracted with the Lloyd Manufacturing Company located in Menominee, 70 miles south of Iron Mountain. Lloyd, a manufacturer of iron patio furniture in peacetime, made the frames, with tubing manufactured by Precision Metals of Brooklyn. The Army supplied other essential parts, including the navigational instruments and cables, along with the landing skid and wheel assemblies. With its experience in automobile manufacturing, Ford engineered all of its glider parts to be interchangeable. Other manufacturers did not always do this. This led to a disaster in St. Louis, where the first glider built by the Robertson Aircraft Company crashed. The ship carried the mayor of St. Louis, the president of the company, and several military officers on a demonstration flight. One wing broke away and the plane plummeted to the ground, killing all on board. An investigation showed that a part of the wing assembly didn't fit properly and was milled to fit it. The deviation weakened the assembly enough that it caused the crash, the wing to fall off. And so all of Robertson's planes were pulled off the line until all these flaws were checked out and repairs made. Iron Mountain was fortunate to not have the labor unrest that was quite common elsewhere. Despite a national no-strike pledge, there were nearly 3,000 work stoppages in 1942 and over 3,700 in 1943. But in Iron Mountain, the pledge was a reality and a matter of pride. In 1943, the Iron Mountain office of the War Production Board, there to make sure Local 952 adhered to the no-strike pledge, closed its doors and moved to Milwaukee. The workers at Iron Mountain built the wings, the ailerons, and the rudder and tail from plywood made at the plant. Other workers in turn covered these with heavy cotton fabric. Another crew made the flooring, which consisted of 8-inch thick pieces of plywood glued in a honeycomb pattern and covered top and bottom with plywood sheets. The honeycomb pattern made a stronger but lightweight floor, theoretically able to withstand the glider's hard landings. The addition of the nose section, which swung up to allow entry for men or equipment, followed. Workers then installed the cables, wires, and instruments. A brief note on instruments. Having worked in a presidential library, I heard this story. In order to be seen at night, they used radium-coated dials. The Harry Truman Library in Missouri had a glider instrument panel on display until they found out about the radioactivity, so they had to move it for safety reasons. It was on loan to a museum from a museum and quickly returned to its owner. The final stage was the installation of the huge wings. Tractors then towed the completed glider through the enlarged body doors. Logistical problems with the CG-4A did not end with construction either. Things did not always work as they should. As designed, the glider was to release its front wheels by parachute after takeoff and then land on permanently attached wooden skids, making the landings on short fields easier. Unfortunately, the wheels did not always jettison as planned, leaving the pilot to bring down a free-rolling ship with limited braking capabilities. Ford engineers continually modified equipment to solve this problem and others related to the glider. Another problem for the glider pilot was to keep his craft above the prop wash of the tow plane, lest the ship and its passengers get tossed about. There is a nylon tow rope that runs between the tow ship and the glider, and wrapped around the tow rope is looped a telephone line, which allowed the two to speak to each other, the pilot and the glider pilot. And the telephone line was a lot longer than the tow rope, because the tow rope would stretch as you were being pulled. And if you used telephone wire and let that stretch, it probably would have snapped. Once the ship reached its landing zone, its problems continued as hard landings generally tore off fabric, damaged wings, bent fuselage frames, and most importantly, tossed its occupants around quite a bit. The Germans defended against glider landings by embedding lengths of steel rods known to glider pilots as Rommel's asparagus into the ground with the intent to rip gliders apart, leading to some horrific crashes. Occasionally, asparagus was installed by slave labor, and that usually broke off fairly easily. Other times, glider pilots used ships already on the ground to stop their own. Consequently, many gliders were useless after their first mission. Following Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France in August 1944, for instance, the Army only salvaged 50 out of 407 gliders utilized in the attack. Still, there were only 150 casualties out of the 7,000 troops who flew in them. Okay. After the workers finished each glider, Ford engineers and an Air Corps liaison officer based in Iron Mountain inspected the work. Because the Ford gliders had fully interchangeable parts, they set the standard for the other glider manufacturers. So pleased was the military that one master sergeant at Army Depot wrote, "The Ford glider is the only one that can be assembled without any difficulty whatsoever. Our people, when they see crates marked Ford, say, 'Thank God for the Ford glider.'" Getting the gliders out of Iron Mountain was the next issue. Ford crews prepared the completed ships for delivery to Dearborn. This wasn't easy, as the Iron Mountain Airport was nearly 2 miles from the assembly plant. It was too small to enable the Army's transport planes, either C-46s or C-47s, to take off with gliders in tow. The Ford Motor Company offered to expand the airport at the government's expense, but the Army declined the offer. Consequently, workers dismantled most of the gliders and shipped the parts in 5 large crates. Specifically designed tractor trailers, originally utilized to carry B-24 fuselages, carried the crates via ferry across Lake Michigan to Dearborn. The 5 crates have their own place in history, with one for the wings, one for the fuselage, and the others for the tail, the nose, and the remaining parts. The cases were quite large. Servicemen overseas valued the crates themselves, as they were approximately 20 feet long and 5 to 10 feet wide, and useful as shelters or as flooring in military tent cities. Many of the CGA gliders were assigned to the British airborne units. The British did not like the CG-4A and nicknamed the Hadrian, One sergeant major from the British Glider Pilot Regiment expressed his displeasure by remarking, "Burn the bloody gliders and fly the bloody crates." Now, I saved you my very poor English accent there. So. In fact, when the Army sold its surplus gliders for $75, remember I said they were $15,000 to make, they're sold for $75 after the war. Most buyers discarded the plane and kept the nearly 20,000 board feet, enough to make a small ranch house of grade A lumber, which explains why so few parts of over 14,000 gliders built even exist today. Another means of shipping the gliders out was by airlifting intact gliders from the Iron Mountain Airport, despite the shortness of the runway. Tractors towed the fully assembled gliders to the airport, where several times each day, C-47 tow planes flew in from Milwaukee. The planes flew low over the field, dragging a hook, which caught nylon rope suspended between two poles, and literally jerked the glider into the sky. The ship went from standing still to speeds to 80 or 90 miles per hour almost instantly. From Milwaukee, the tow planes took their charges, in some cases 2 gliders to a C-47 or C-46, either to Dearborn for shipment overseas or to the Army's Glider Crew Training Center at Bowman Field near Louisville, Kentucky. Before the pilots received their training at Bowman, they put in 8 weeks of pre-flight work plus 45 hours of flight instruction at 23 colleges across the country. Locally, these included Wayne University, University of Detroit, Michigan State College, and Highland Park Junior College. By September 1943, the Iron Mountain plant fulfilled its first contract of 1,000 CG-4A gliders. In June 1943, even before that contract expired, the Army awarded a second contract for an additional 1,200 ships. At the same time, the plant raised its daily production from 5 to 9 gliders. In June 1943, when Ford accepted the second glider contract, the company also reluctantly agreed to build a Waco glider capable of carrying 30 men. Ford initially wanted no part of this larger glider, designated the YCG-13, as the company felt it would not be worthwhile to remove additional equipment from its number 2 body plant for the short period of time required to construct the 50 ships the Army wanted. In addition, Ford argued, between the construction of the B-24, the CG-4A, the Pratt & Whitney engine, and as well as other defense-related projects, the engineering department was operating at full capacity and had no time to retool for a new glider. The Army persisted, and the company eventually acquiesced and accepted the contract late in 1943, but only after the Army increased the number of ships to 150 and made Ford one of only 2 producers of the glider. By December 1943, the engineering department had all the drawings, lofts, and templates which would facilitate production of the new ship. Engineers even experimented with a center seat, which allowed for an additional 12 men. They pushed to complete the project since, according to Ford's government contracts department, the CG-13 type glider had a high priority rating. While the craft had priority over its smaller counterpart, production did not begin in earnest until June 1944. Far too late for the D-Day Normandy invasion, the operation for which the Army likely conceived the CG-13. In September 1944, the Army canceled the contract, leaving Ford 63 planes short of fulfilling it. Though Ford only built 87 of the bigger ships, construction of the CG-4A dropped considerably from an average of 167 in the first 5 months in 1944 to 85 for the next 4. With the cancellation of that contract, the plant returned to full production of the 15-man model. Between October 1944 and August 1945, with additional Army contracts, the workers at Iron Mountain built another 1,800 gliders, with each month exceeding the previous month's production in all but one. But the production line halted for good on August 17, 1945, when, with the surrender of Japan, the Army canceled nearly all of its defense contracts. In all, over 20 manufacturing companies produced nearly 14,000 CG-4A gliders. The converted station wagon body plant at Iron Mountain, the largest single producer, supplied over 4,200 of them, nearly one-third the Army's total. Ford also made nearly three-quarters of the CG-13s accepted by the Army. The latter never saw combat but were used as transports in France and in England. Besides gliders, workers made floors and tables for the B-24, as well as wood shelving and wooden parts for Jeeps, stake and cargo trucks. Chemical plant made ethyl alcohol used as a lacquer on military vehicles, and a briquette plant over the course of the war produced 75% of the nation's charcoal. In June 1944, with Henry Ford II in attendance, the Iron Mountain plant received the first of its 3 Army-Navy E production awards for meritorious service on the production front. The other E awards came in February and September of 1945. There were other gliders. The Army also contracted for the CG-10, although not with Ford. The CG-10 could carry 42 troops, or 205 millimeter howitzers, or a 155 millimeter M1A1 howitzer, or either a 2.5 ton 6x6 or a 1.5 ton 6x6 truck. This was designed for the invasion of Japan, and it does not appear to have ever been operational. Waco also made the XCG-15, which was developed from the CG-4A. It carried the same number of men, but had shorter wings and a more streamlined nose, and enabled it to travel faster. Only 1,000 were ordered, but only 473 were delivered before the war ended. Another experimental glider was the XCG-17. This was a C-47 with its engines removed. The glider could be towed by a C-54 at 290 miles an hour, but its airframe did not make it feasible to land on rough terrain as is normally encountered in combat. Other combatants used gliders as well. The Germans had several types, including the DFS-230, which carried 9 men. The British used both the Horsa, capable of carrying 30 troops, and the Hamilcar, designed to carry heavier equipment. As a practical weapon, the glider left much to be desired, with glider-borne units attached to the 101st Airborne Division suffering casualties even before they embarked for duty overseas. In light of these problems, Major General William Carey Lee, first commander of the 101st Airborne and generally acknowledged as the father of U.S. airborne forces, stated publicly that parachuting out of an airplane was a much safer and practical method of assault than the use of gliders, and I believe there's probably a couple of people here who would agree with that. Congress apparently agreed with the general, though, for in June 1944, it passed legislation giving glider-borne troops the same hazardous duty as the paratroops. Even with their many problems, gliders did see action in all 3 theaters of the war. In Europe, the first glider operation, the invasion of Sicily, was a disaster as United States Navy ships mistakenly shot at the tow planes, forcing them to release their gliders early. Consequently, many failed to make land and ditched in the Mediterranean Sea, drowning many soldiers. Other tow planes returned fully loaded to North Africa, having never released their gliders. The lessons learned in Sicily proved helpful in the Normandy invasion in June 1944, where the 3 vertical stripes improved identification. Gliders were also used in Operation Dragoon in August 1944, the invasion of southern France, and Operation Market Garden in September 1944. The largest and most successful glider operation was Operation Varsity, the assault across the Rhine in March 1945, which used 900 CG-4As, including for the first time double tows. For a double tow, you had one plane, one length of rope was a lot shorter than the other, so you weren't bumping into each other. To a lesser extent, the Army used gliders to deliver ammunition and medical supplies, most notably to the besieged 101st Airborne at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Gliders also saw action in the Pacific, particularly in the Battle for New Guinea and in the China-Burma-India theater, delivering supplies over the hump to Burma. In all, the Ford Motor Company manufactured a wide variety of material for the Ford war effort. Besides the B-24 and the gliders, they made Jeeps, armored cars, trucks, and aircraft engines. This is a postcard that I bought. And that's obviously the Liberator and the CG-13. For the community of Iron Mountain, as with all cities across the country, war's end brought a cause for great celebration. Almost immediately, Ford began to reconvert the plant for the purpose of producing bodies for Ford and Mercury station wagons, as well as a convertible roadster. The plant was ready in time for the 1946 model year, but the celebration in Iron Mountain did not last very long. Many could see that the glory days of the Ford plant, the area's primary source of income, were coming to an end. The war, which was for many industries an economic savior, was also to be the cause of the plant's demise. War-related technology allowed manufacturers to make their products cheaper and faster. And most importantly, to Iron Mountain, where the types of wood products manufactured there were becoming obsolete. New and improved aircraft and weapon systems refined during the war made the troop-carrying glider a phenomena unique to World War II. Even the Korean War, which only began 5 years later, had little need for wood products when it came to war material. In the production of domestic automobiles, the lessons learned in steel manufacturing during the war all but ended the need for wooden body parts. Station wagon production continued at Iron Mountain, but each year saw less wood and more steel being used. Soon, wood was used merely as body trim, and less wood meant less employees. Besides technological advances, other factors contributed to Iron Mountain's particular problem. Perhaps the most important of these was a change in the company's leadership. In 1945, Henry Ford resigned in favor of his grandson, Henry Ford II. Unfortunately for Iron Mountain, the younger Ford did not share his grandfather's affection for the company's Upper Peninsula holdings. Henry Ford actually used the freighter Henry Ford II had a suite on it, would use that as his yacht to go up to the Upper Peninsula and spend time at his different plants. Among the first casualties were Ford's smaller sawmill complexes across the Upper Peninsula, with the exception of the Lance plant on Keweenaw Bay. Layoffs with little hope of recall became common at the body plant. Besides the use of less wood and body production, Ford cited a high cost of transportation, which required sending steel bodies to Iron Mountain by rail or ship from River Rouge. You have to remember that we didn't have the Mackinac Bridge until 1957. After the body plant added the wood trim, those same steel bodies had to be shipped back to Dearborn to finish the automobile. Finally, in June 1951, the company announced the impending closure of the entire Iron Mountain complex. On December 7th, the last station wagon rolled off the line, ending more than 30 years of Ford presence in the Upper Peninsula. Between the June announcement and the actual closing date, Local 952 worked with the company to find a suitable buyer. Ideally, they hoped for an automobile manufacturer, but none of them approached Ford to buy the property. In mid-December 1951, Ford finally sold the property to the Kingsford Chemical Company, which continued to produce charcoal briquettes and other chemicals for the plant for the next decade. During the years following the sale, Local 952 remained the sole bargaining representative for the workers, having won the right after a 130-day strike in the summer of 1953. But in 1961, citing the same problems Ford had in 1951, and adding to their lament the high cost of labor, Kingsford Chemical Company closed its doors and dismantled all but the body plant buildings. Despite efforts by the union and local businessmen to find new tenants, the plant remained closed. Finally, in March 1953, the UAW revoked the charter of Local 952 and struck it from its rolls. The post-war passing of the Ford Iron Mountain plant as a viable industrial complex was not a unique occurrence in Michigan. The state, which built its economy on the strength of the automobile industry, failed to take advantage of the breakthroughs in aeronautical and electronics-based industries spawned by the war. Defense contracts constituted a small portion of the auto industry's post-war production. Even the Willow Run plant, where Ford produced nearly 9,000 B-24 Liberator bombers, converted almost immediately to automobile production. In 2005, the Menominee Range Historical Foundation created the World War II Glider and Military Museum in Iron Mountain. The centerpiece is a completely restored CG-4A glider. The Kalamazoo Air Zoo also has a CG-4A. And the Fighting Falcon Military Museum in Greenville, Michigan, honors the gliders produced there by the Gibson Refrigerator Company. Due to space restrictions, their exhibit contains only a fuselage. I would recommend, if you have the time, to visit all three of these museums, although Greenville does have very limited visiting hours. Now, here are a few samples of glider advertisements that I found in magazines purchased from eBay over the years. Or else were on display at the Glider Museum in Iron Mountain, or I got from a colleague in Norway, Michigan by the name of Guy Forstrom. 1942, this is the advent of the gliders, so we have strange birds on the horizon. 1943 is different gliders, survival of the fightiness, but the glider there is a CG-3, which only carried a limited amount of people. Didn't have the swing out front, so they had to jump over the top to get out of it. Where planes fear to tread. This is from March of 1943. All these ads were put out by Waco in Flying Magazine, excuse me. July 1943, where silence is golden. Again, July 1943, they strike at dawn. This is the Grand Rapids Industries Incorporated. I'm not exactly sure what. I think they didn't build the actual gliders. They did parts. August 1943, a carriage for the Queen. Now, I didn't realize the infantry was known as the Queen of Battle. I'm not sure the infantry would like to be known as the Queen of Battle, but that's what the ad says. September 1943, another Waco first, and this was they were able to pull a glider all the way across the Atlantic. So I called it Waco for many, many years until I found out like 3 months ago it was Waco and not Waco. So maybe some of the guys who flew in the gliders may have thought it was Waco. But then we have a surprise. This one, it's interesting that the Jeep is coming out with guns ablazing, but the pilots had to get out of the way first before they raised up that nose.
It's a pilot on the hood.
Yeah, maybe that. Yeah, that might be true. He's hanging on for dear life. All right, this is January of 1944, and the old master sergeant wondering what's going on. April 1944, this is the ad for the CG-13. May 1944, the Sunday Punch. Now, this next one it's from June of 1944. So you've got gliders flying in. You've got this mule, which I assume flew in on, but there's also crates in the background too. So I'm not exactly sure how this actually worked. August 1944, it's all in knowing the ropes, and here you can see the nylon rope, but the telephone line is missing. September 1944, and the gliders led the way. This is Waco's just that went my water. Waco's tribute to the D-Day invasion. And Hitchhikers to Hell and Back. This is an illustration of a glider being picked up by a C-47. I can't really tell what it is by that picture. That is from September of 1944. December 1944. I never saw any research, anything in my research about them being stopped by a parachute. Maybe somebody knows that for sure. April 1945 is the CG-15, followed by, there's a 13, there's a CG-4A, and a CG-3 way up at the top there. June 1945, This is the Curtis Command. It's an ad for Curtis Commandos, but it's pulling a pair of gliders, and that's so my guess would be that would be the Operation Varsity, where they did use the double toes. Now this is a postcard sort of thing. It's on the table over there. This is the front showing the CG-4A, but on the back is an ad from Ford telling you to make sure you take your car in and get its maintenance and everything. But it also tells you to buy bonds. And this was a Coca-Cola ad with a CG-4A. Now, those colors were never used in combat, but I guess those are probably pre-war colors. And that is all. That's all I have, thank you. And I am perfectly willing to. Anxious for questions, criticisms? Oh, okay.
Did they operate glider cores after World War II? Did they keep a glider capability for a few years after the war?
They had a few, but they didn't. I'm not sure they had a core of them or not. I know they did have gliders. They did have gliders for a little while, though.
Because the guy I flew with in the military, he said his father was a glider pilot, and he was stationed down near Fayetteville, North Carolina, at a field down there that till about 1947 had gliders.
Yeah, they did. They did have gliders for a while, yes. But they were never used in combat again.
No, okay.
Yeah. Way back there.
How many did Gibson build?
You'd have to ask. I don't know. I don't have the breakdown for all the different plants. I'm sorry. 1,078. Thank you. Yes, sir.
How extensive was the flight training for a glider pilot? That's my first question. And my second question is, once they landed, if they landed safely, did the glider pilot then become a combatant along with his fellow travelers?
Initially, their job was to get back or help out at aid stations and things. There was a unit that was actually created as an infantry unit at Operation Market Garden, and they were involved in a battle. The Battle of Burp Gun Corner is a famous glider pilot's battle. You can read about. You can read it find it on Wikipedia. Although Wikipedia is asking for money again right now, so you might want to wait a while. There was. They had. Well, I mentioned it earlier. They had 45 hours of flight training, 8 weeks of 45 of aviation training before they even got in a plane. In the glider, and then they also had several weeks of training at Bowman Field before they actually got in. But in some cases, a gentleman here can tell you if they didn't have a co-pilot, one of the other guys might fly it, as he told me he did.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's one that hasn't landed yet, and that's the other watch. That's a lot of the glider pilots were washed out fighter pilots.
Yes, yeah, they were. They were. That was, and they weren't officers either. They were warrant officers. They were not sort of a mid-range above a non-com and below an officer. So that's a glider on there.
What era
Okay.
is this watch?
Huh?
What year was this watch built, do you know?
Oh, that's modern.
Oh, yeah. They left the 3 body plants, and the kilns are still up there. The body plants they build load-all garbage trucks up there, trash trucks there. So that's still, there's still some industry in Iron Mountain, but I was up there in August, and it just looks different than the last time I was there, which was like 2005, those buildings are almost 100 years old now. So in 2003, they knocked down the 2 chimneys that marked the power station, the powerhouse, and that was like a sad moment for me. Anything else? Yes, sir.
My name is Charles Day. I'm the secretary of the National World War II Glider Pilot Association. I just want you to know that because you said two things very early in your program that are totally incorrect.
That's what I want to hear.
You said that the tubing was aluminum and it was steel. And the other was the fact that the glider, when the glider, say that when it was set up to be organized, General Arnold ordered that there would be no aluminum and that there would be no aircraft manufacturers who would be involved in contracts for the gliders because he wanted in no way for the gliders or any other type of production to interfere with bomber and fighter production.
Yeah, well, that's probably true, but there were those companies.
But they were not major manufacturers.
Right.
An interesting trivia here is the Gibson Refrigerator Company also made the flaps for the B-24 bomber.
Well, Ford had experience. They had built airplanes in the 20s, the stout aircraft.
Well, the first CG-4A was assembled in the hangar from the corner of the where you go into the Henry Ford and the Parkway.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's when there was an airport there. Now it's a proving ground.
That hangar that's in that corner was where they assembled the first CG-4.
Way back there.
I have a question. I talked to an RAF glider pilot in World War II. I was in World War II. He said that they would actually put a lot of decking, like that extra armor plating on the floors of the gliders. Did the U.S. ever do that?
They were pretty well balanced. I mean, that was, if you ever see the movie Saving Private Ryan, they have this scene about a glider crash, and first of all, they had like 21 guys on this plane when there was only supposed to be 15. And then they talk about some general who flew over with his Jeep, and they put reinforcement for the Jeep underneath. And no wonder this glider crashed. It was severely overloaded. So I'm not sure about the reinforcement. Maybe gentlemen who. You first. Yes, sir.
Dickinson County Library, which is where I'm.
Right. Well, I've been doing research on the Ford Motor Company in the Upper Peninsula since I was an undergraduate at Michigan Tech, starting in 1975. You drive up up the Keweenaw Peninsula on the other side of the Keweenaw Bay is a Ford water tower. I grew up on the east side of Detroit. I said, what the heck is that doing there? So it's been my research. It's been numerous papers and things that I've worked on. It's nice that I have the Ford Museum nearby. The UAW records are at the Wayne State. So my sources are fairly close. So. Yes, sir.
The Fighting Falcon was made by Gibson,
Yes.
and the students of Greenville High School raised money to build a glider.
Right.
They wound up raising enough money to build 7 of them.
Yes.
The Fighting Falcon was dedicated on the football field in Greenville. And the commander of the 82nd Airborne was there, and he told him it would be the first glider to land in Europe, and it certainly was, because when he unhooked from the airplane, it went augured right in.
Pretty much. Yeah, actually, next May is the 75th anniversary of the school kids raising the money, and actually, I'm giving a similar talk up there, right on May 29th. But they're also when I was up there a couple months ago, I met the people there, and I said I was doing this talk, and they asked me, "Do you know any Rosies?" Because they want to have Rosies there too, and Megan, who I worked with here, and
Bill Delp, you met?
his daughter, no, I don't think it was him. It's a fellow. I can't think of his name. It's Christensen or something like that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
How about the casualty rate among the pilots and the troops they were carrying, since those were...
It was pretty high, because, I mean, if you're coming in combat, these are canvas-covered things. There is no real reinforcement underneath them. And so you're bumping into things. You're getting shot down, your tow rope gets cut loose before you're ready, that kind of stuff. The casualties were fairly high.
Dad was in the 319th Glider Field Artillery, and they had 40% casualties just landing on Normandy.
In Normandy,
Yes.
in Normandy there were like 1,050-some glider pilots, pilot and co-pilot in the U.S. gliders. And I'm not sure whether this includes the horses that the U.S. flew in Normandy, but out of like 1,000-some glider pilots, there were 20 of them killed. So, and the horse glider had a casualty rate, the death rate of 3.17%, and the CG-4A had a 0.07 killed rate for passengers in the Normandy invasion.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
The general you and killed him.
Right, yeah, well, yes.
One more in the back here.
In operation, does both the tow plane and the glider have release mechanisms? And was there ever any failures of the release mechanism?
I assume there were failures, but yes, each one could release. There was a thing on each end. The glider in Iron Mountain, I was up there in August, and the fellow who restored it says to me, "You want to go inside?" And sure, of course I do. and they have a fully everything that you need for this. I mean, they've got the flare gun and all this other stuff, and it was really quite interesting to see. So again, it's a 500-mile drive, but it's a go now. It's fall. The colors are probably good. So okay.
Well, thank you very much. This was a fascinating meeting.
Thank you.